Hello everyone and welcome. My name is John Sainthouse and I'm Group Director of inTEC Education. We are the education-focused division of the inTEC Group, and we specialise in working with schools and educational organisations, helping them solve all kinds of IT challenges. This may include networks, Wi-Fi, support services and very importantly, cybersecurity. I'm delighted to be joined today by Alex Henderson. He's Head of IT Services at Eton College, and prior to joining Eton, he had a very successful career in IT management and is known as a cybersecurity expert. Today's discussion will focus around the topic of cybersecurity and particularly how independent schools can cope with the challenge. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, John.
May I start by asking you, what do you think are the major threats facing independent schools today?
Well, our old friends of viruses and malware and denial of service and hacking, they've always been around, they're still here, they're not going to go away, but they're not really changing very much from year to year. And they're not really aimed at schools. We all take the appropriate precautions to make sure that they don't damage our day-to-day operations, but we don't feel under attack from them. The new kid on the block, if you like, is ransomware. It's only been around for a few years and it's a much more pervasive threat and certainly is targeting schools. There are the threats of phishing and smishing and malicious emails and texts, which should certainly not be ignored, but they are normally trying to push ransomware as their end game. So I would say the threat is ransomware and the others are vectors.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree. We have seen the ransomware increasing massively, particularly with schools. But do you see the nature of cyber threats evolving over time?
I think it has. I think that 10 years ago, there were really two types of cyber threat. There was the high-end targeted threats at government and military and large corporates, and schools weren't on their radar at all. And then there was the low-end viruses and malware, which were floating around. And as I say, we all took precautions, but we didn't feel they were aimed at us. But now with ransomware and untraceable cyber cryptocurrencies, the risk of ransomware is vastly higher than it ever was before, and these criminals that produce this software are very much targeting organisations that they think are worth targeting, that they feel are in a position to pay a ransom and actually have something worth stealing.
Yes, I think that's a good point. And we must remember that nowadays these people, they're professional criminals and they are absolutely ruthless in their aims, which is to effectively extort money. And they really don't care about how they do that or the impact it has on people.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, ransomware was estimated to cost $11 billion in 2019 globally and $20 billion in 2020. And that's about 50 times more than it was only 5 years ago. So this is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry.
It is indeed. And do you think that schools in particular have a threat?
It slightly depends what you mean. If you mean, are schools more likely to be targeted, I would say probably not much. Ransomware tends to come in by phishing emails. That's the most common vector. About 2/3 of ransomware attacks start with phishing. That's very much a scattergun approach. It will go to all industries and individuals. I don't think schools are particularly a target. If you mean, are schools more likely to fall victim, then I think the answer is probably yes. We've got, by our definition, a large percentage of our user base are children. They are more likely to be perhaps a bit more naive, a bit more prone to explore and experiment online than adults might. A lot of schools have a large BYOD implementation, so there are hundreds, thousands of devices on our networks over which we have limited control. We can manage the firewall rules and the network security, but we can't control whether the devices are patched, whether they've got antivirus on them. So yes, I think there is a higher chance that a phishing link will get clicked in a school. I think there's a higher chance that a clicked link will cause damage in a school.
Yeah, again, I agree. And that's certainly the experience we've seen as well. In fact, sometimes I've called independent schools as hackers' honeypots because the attractiveness of the independent school, the data they have, and the reputations they need to protect as well. So they can be a very attractive target.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, on that basis, is it really a big threat for us?
Well, I think it is. I think that it is very much out there and potentially could really cripple any organisation that that falls victim to it. It can release your parent database, your alumni database online. It can completely cripple the day-to-day operations of any organisation that falls victim to it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and unfortunately we have schools that come to us for help when they've been attacked, and it can be absolutely devastating. And it can be a school of any size and at all, really. I remember a school that had a small school with 200 pupils. It was a prep school, but they had a ransomware attack. Everything was encrypted, no access to any data, and they were out for a number of weeks before we could get some systems back. And even now, 2 years down the line, they still have no access to some of their data. So it can be absolutely devastating, I agree. So this all sounds rather scary, but what can schools do to protect themselves from ransomware?
I think before I answer that, you need to understand exactly what ransomware is and how it works. There are many types of ransomware, just like the COVID or the common cold. There are different strains and they all require a slightly different vaccine, but there are commonalities between them. Ransomware will always try to encrypt your data and charge a fee to give it back or to refrain from publishing it online. Now, as you said, they often don't recover it all, but that's the process that they will encrypt your data. It nearly always starts with some form of social engineering, probably a phishing email, but not necessarily. It could come in through an encrypted, a corrupted website, a USB stick. It could be somebody visiting an unsanctioned VPN service. So there are all kinds of vectors where it can be introduced into your network. And once you've got this one initial infection, it will try to spread. It will do whatever it can to find administrator credentials, to move from computer to computer. It will probably encrypt every piece of information on every network share on those computers. It will probably target your backups. If you delete a file today, you can recover it from yesterday's backup. But if your files are encrypted, then if your backups are encrypted too, then that hasn't helped you at all.
Yes, and I think the worrying nature of cybercrime is often they are one step ahead. They're so well funded, they're so professional that it's a big challenge to try and keep up with the ever-evolving threats, as you say. So this all sounds quite grim and depressing. So what can we do?
Well, there are things we can do. The defence, I think, should be broken into 4 aspects. There's prevention, detection, mitigation, and recovery. And by prevention, I mean anything you can do to stop that initial infection, whether that's protecting your email services, whether that is tightening your firewalls, simply educating your users on the risks and what they can do and must not do, so that you prevent that first infection ever reaching your network. Detection is much more about if you get that first infection, how do you know that it's there? How quickly do you know, in order that you can take remedial action and stop one infected computer become 100 infected computers across your network? That, unfortunately, is the expensive bit. AI-driven detection tools are very clever, but they're not cheap. If you can persuade your board of governors that spending £10,000 on a smart detection tool in order to save £1 million ransom is money well spent, well, great, go for it. But if your budget doesn't stretch to it, then I would suggest you don't worry too much about detection at this stage. Concentrate your efforts on prevention, mitigation, and recovery.
Yes, I agree. And you mentioned about backups becoming encrypted, and again, we've seen that from our experience, where schools have been attacked and tried to recover data from the backup system, but it's all been encrypted as well. So even some of these measures schools have taken to protect themselves can't always be relied on.
Well, that's true, because one of the dirty tricks that ransomware often plays is it lies dormant on your network for days, weeks, months, even before the payload activates. And so you could well find that for several months you've been backing up infected data, and you might need to step quite a long way back in the past to find a backup that predates the initial infection and is therefore free of the encryption code.
Yes, very, very, very important, and I think the whole backup strategy is crucial to your ability to recover should and when you be attacked with ransomware. But you mentioned about the mitigation side of things. Can you expand on that a bit more?
Well, by mitigation, I mean if you imagine the scenario that you have got that initial infection, what can you do to prevent it spreading, to limit the damage it causes? What should you do to your network now so that if the worst should happen, it's one device, not 100 devices that go down? There are a number of things we can do. This is the part of the process that bursars tend to enjoy because it's largely free. It doesn't cost you anything to improve your policies. I would suggest that you enable multi-factor authentication if you haven't already done so. It's not difficult, it's free, it's really a no-brainer. Everyone should have it. Little things like stopping your users being local administrators of their computers. If somebody clicks on a phishing link and it tries to install some ransomware code, if their user account is an administrator, it will simply install silently and they'll never know. If they're not an administrator, there's a much higher chance it'll pop up a login box, it won't install, they'll notice it's there, and you've stopped that infection happening. Don't have the same administrator password on all your computers across the network. Some ransomware code installs a keylogger. So if one person logs in with administrator credentials, the ransomware will harvest those credentials and can then use them to log into every other computer across your network. How much safer will you feel if you know that one infected computer remains one infected computer?
Completely agree, Alex, thank you. And I think you raised some good points there, particularly with the measures that can be done for free, effectively, or at very low cost. But I guess some schools have technical expertise in-house, some schools don't. And the key thing there, I think, is that these things can be done. They're not always very difficult to do, but sometimes schools may need to ask for some extra help to do that.
You may indeed, and there are more complex mitigation steps one can take. For instance, not using deprecated network protocols like TLS 1.0 or SMB1. These are very well-documented vulnerabilities, but how well do you know every device on your network to know if anything's using them? If you've got a 10-year-old photocopier that only works on SMB1, have you left that protocol running on your network to service this legacy kit? If so, I would suggest you think of some investment there to replace the kit that requires it, and don't just live with the loophole. That's how the NHS came unstuck with WannaCry, but they've got £1 million MRI scanners that required Windows XP to run. We don't have that in a school, so there isn't so much of an excuse to have legacy equipment and outdated technologies running.
Absolutely, and I think, again, it's something where, even with the biggest budget in the world and all measures of protection in place, there always really remains a chink in the armour, we find, so there's always a weakness somewhere. So it's not something you can completely control. But is there anything else that can be done?
Well, I think the most important thing is to have a good backup strategy. That, as you say, there is always going to be a chink in the armour. You can spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on cybersecurity and you'll never be 100% protected. There'll always be something that comes along which was only written yesterday and your protection didn't know about it. So you've always got to assume that the worst could happen to you and make sure that all your data is properly and securely backed up.
Yes, good. And again, some schools may need some help with that. Some schools are comfortable. And there are different strategies for backup. Is that something you could give some words of advice on?
Well, absolutely. I mean, backups used to be tape-based. Tape was nice and cheap. It wasn't very quick. And then people moved to disk-based backups, which are much easier to run, much quicker. However, disks fill up, and there will come a time when your older backups get overwritten. And as we said earlier, if your ransomware has been sitting on your network for 3 months, make sure that your backups are 4 months old. Don't have the oldest copy of all your data being only a few weeks old, because you might need to step back longer than that. The watchword here is immutability. Make sure you have copies of your data that cannot be changed once they're made. And that way, if you do pick up an infection, you've got a ring-fence safe copy. It might be a few months old, but you've got it.
Agreed. And some schools have used cloud backup technologies. And just a word of caution for me on that is not all of them give that level of immutability that perhaps is expected. So they're not all the same. So
they're not all the same, and you get what you pay for. And I think my advice would be to have a combination of local disk-based backup and a cloud-based immutable backup. That cloud backups are great, but they're not terribly quick because everything's at the wrong end of your internet line. To have a local copy for, whoops, I've deleted a file, can I have it back please, gives a nice fast response to your users, but you do need that off-site immutable copy, and a cloud solution is the best way of doing it.
Good, thank you, Alex. So a lot of what we've spoken about, they're quite technical things. We're talking about immutability, we're talking about MFA, a few technical buzzwords. So that makes me think, ultimately, is the responsibility for cybersecurity an IT department thing, or is it bigger than that?
I think one could say that the responsibility is everyone's, that anyone can click on a phishing link. Everyone needs to do what they can to stop the infections arriving. But someone has got to take the lead on implementing whatever changes are needed, providing the training to your staff. That, I think, is inevitably an IT function. Schools are unlikely to have a dedicated CISO or head of security. So whether it's your IT director or your network manager or how your school is structured, that will vary from school to school. But I think it's an IT function to take ownership of it. But any change must come with a mandate from your senior leadership team or your governors. They are the ones who are ultimately responsible. They're the ones who will have to answer to the parents if you close the school for a month because it's gone wrong. Some of these changes won't be terribly popular with some staff. They might like being local administrators. They might find MFAs rather annoying. If the change comes with a mandate from your governors, it's a much easier process for you to install. And I would say the responsibility is on the IT department to advise the senior leadership team and the governors on the risks, the consequences, and make recommendations on the changes that their school needs to implement. And that then comes with a mandate from the governors to do that across the board. It's much easier to implement those changes.
Agreed. And with the consequences, I think we should always think about the impact these events have on the school community. So it is, if there is an attack and the school's out of action, it affects everybody. It affects the staff, it affects the parents, and also the pupils. And I remember there was a case last year where a school had a ransomware attack literally the day before exam results were due to be published. And obviously that caused a huge amount of stress, particularly for the pupils, which was very upsetting. But as I say, the cyber criminals don't care. They'll just exploit whatever they can, whenever they can, to make money. So, I think in terms of how much money to spend on cybersecurity, it's an unanswerable question.
It is. Most of the prevention and the mitigation steps are free or low cost, or they're encouraging you to do something you probably know you ought to have done before, like replace that 10-year-old photocopier. So many of the steps to become more secure are free, but the more expensive parts, the AI detection tools, can be very expensive. Employing a dedicated cybersecurity person is not cheap. It will come to how your school perceives the threat and what budget they feel they can justify. the one place I would recommend you spend money is on your backups.
Yes, absolutely. Good. Thank you, Alex. That's all been very, very useful and interesting. So if we were to wrap things up in a way and prioritise a few things, where do you think most people should start in that list?
I think there are 4 things that everybody should do, which are to implement MFA if you haven't already done so, train your users regularly, secure your workstations, so patching and lock them down so they're not administrator, or the users are not administrators, and to invest in your backups. I think those are the 4 steps that will help you sleep at night.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Really appreciate your input on that, and I hope this has been a very useful discussion for everybody who's viewing this. It's a massive topic and obviously can get very complicated, and at times schools will all need some help, be that internally with the IT teams or with partners as well. If this has stimulated any further thoughts from you, or you want to discuss anything we've mentioned further, please do get in touch with any of the team at inTEC Education. We'd be absolutely delighted to have a further chat with you. I hope this has been very useful. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Alex for his time, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you, John.